Well, good afternoon, everybody. We want to thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. We're going to get started as more people are joining us. My name is Joan Clay, and I am the staff attorney at the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic at UIC John Marshall. In our clinic, we work with entrepreneurs as far as their needs for entity formation. We give guidance on what type of entities best suit their mission and their business models. We work for-profit and nonprofit entrepreneurs. We help with preparing your filings with the Secretary of State. We provide governing documents such as your bylaws or your operating agreements. And we give advice on contracts, commercial leases, those sort of documents. So the way that our clinic works is we take on new clients twice a year, in August and in January. And the reason being is that coordinates with our semesters at the law school. Our second and third year law students are student attorneys, and they work directly with our clinic clients. So if anyone is interested in becoming a client for our clinic, one of the last slides that we have will have my contact information, as well as the director for the clinic, Renee Hatcher. The law students are supervised under both of us. We are both Illinois licensed attorneys. So what I would like to encourage you to do is, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please write those into the chat box. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be responding to questions at the end of the presentation. And then also, if there's questions that you need to have for follow-up after our presentation, again, you'll have the contact information for myself and for Renee Hatcher at our clinic. But I do want to go ahead and get started with our presentation. Again, we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put those into the chat box, and we'll be addressing those as we go along. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today are the Illinois cannabis licenses, and as they pertain to craft grower, infuser, and transporter applications. We're going to talk about the zoning requirements. We're going to talk about exactly what is zoning and what's required for a special use zoning permit. And then I'm going to start talking about some other options for people to consider, and then we'll have some resources for you. So let's get started. Next slide. As you all know from looking at the applications, these are going to be reviewed by the Illinois Department of Agriculture, and they're going to review the license for the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter. And there are points distributed for different aspects of your application. And as you will note,
Hi, everyone. I think Joe may have lost sound. We're just going to give it 1 second to reestablish the connection.
okay, I think I'm back if everyone can hear me. What I want to talk about are some of the points that are going to be distributed based on the suitability of your proposed facility. They look at several aspects to give out the point distribution, and one of those is the suitability of your facility. That is for the craft grower and also for the infuser. We can go to the next slide. again, as you can see, we have the points distribution for the Infuser application. 75 points go towards the suitability of the proposed facility. Transporter license, you also have to have a location identified, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at the actual application itself. Next slide, please. Now, for all of the licenses, the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter license, your location has to be identified on your application. For the craft grower and the infuser applications, it is Exhibit O. For the transporter license application, it is Exhibit K. They ask you to list the address, and then you also have to take this form to your local zoning to have it signed off on. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk about the zoning requirements for the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter license applications. The local zoning authority must affirm the location. And what they have to affirm is that the location is in compliance with currently enacted local zoning approval to operate a craft grower, an infuser, or a transporter business, or they have to certify that you've applied for a local zoning approval to operate that business, or that there are no applicable currently enacted zoning regulations in effect in that area at this time. Next slide. Now, what is zoning? Zoning is the process of permitting or prohibiting property to be used for different purposes. There's residential, there's commercial, and there are categories within the commercial for zoning. It allows the cities and towns to really plan and regulate the development that takes place in their area. So you'll need to apply for a special use permit for your cannabis business location. And your local zoning authority is going to need to complete a section of the application, Exhibit O or Exhibit K, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide. We go to the next slide, please. Now, there's a process involved with applying for zoning special use permit. And right now, the slides that you're going to see over the next couple of slides will be Chicago specific. So for those who are looking to put their business, whether it's the craft grower, the infuser, or the transporter within the city of Chicago, these are Chicago specific. But let me say that different towns, villages, etc., also have a process for zoning. So it will be similar to what we're going to show here. As far as the zoning, there's a 3-step process. So you have to submit a completed special use application with the required exhibits to the zoning board. There is a fee in the city of Chicago for $1,025. Step 2 involves giving public notice. And then step 3 will be a public hearing before the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals. Next slide. Now, you have to carefully follow that application checklist. If you don't own the property that you have in mind to use for your business, the property owner must provide its own set of economic disclosure statements, and they have to give written consent to the application. This lets the zoning department know that the landlord is aware that you plan to operate a cannabis business on that property. You'll also need a denial zoning letter. There's a checklist, and we have the link to the checklist here in the presentation. The presentation can be emailed, but this checklist is also found at the site for the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals. This checklist will give you some good guidance on what you need to include with your application. It's a good way to check as you go along to make sure that you have a complete application, because you can't get to the next step unless you have everything included. Next slide, please. Now, for the special use application, what you have to do is provide a narrative. So that's a description of what you're hoping to achieve with the special use application and why they need, why you need special use approval. There's the application fee that I mentioned. There's an affidavit included. That affidavit is asserting that everything that you've included in your packet is true. There's notice letters that you have to send out to the property owners within 250 feet of your proposed location for your cannabis business. So you have to include a copy of your notice letter, the address mailing labels, and the signed affidavit. Now there's a sample letter that's provided in the application, and it gives you some guidance on how you could, what sort of information you need to include in the letter that you're going to send out to the property owners within 250 feet of that location. There have to be economic disclosure forms, and you disclose any potential conflicts of interest with any elected officials or department heads. You also have to list all the owners and their company and any other people who have an economic interest in the company. If the applicant is going to rent the property, again, the property owner must also fill out the economic disclosure. And then you need to include a site plan, landscape plan, building elevations, floor plans, and plat of survey. These are all technical documents of the property, and they'll need to be prepared at times by an urban planner or a contractor, or plat of surveys can be done by survey companies. They also want photographs, color photographs of the building, and it has to be a current photo. And these have to be taken by the applicant or your agent. And then again, signed authorization of the property owner. So if, for example, you're going to be leasing property, whoever owns the property has to provide authorization to the applicant to apply for that special use approval. Next slide, please. Now, with the public notice requirements, once you submit that application to the Zoning Board of Appeals, the zoning office will provide you with public notices. These have to be posted on the building within 5 days, and they have to be visible to all nearby streets. The applicant must then turn in that affidavit stating that you actually hung those signs, and you have to provide some evidence in the form of pictures to the zoning office. Once the zoning office receives that affidavit and the pictures, they'll schedule you to appear at the next available Zoning Board of Appeals public hearing. The Zoning Board of Appeals in the city of Chicago holds public hearings every third Friday of every month. Next slide. Now, the public notice requirement for community meetings, and again, this is Chicago specific, but keep in mind that local villages and towns also follow a process for that special use. You have to publish notice of the community meeting in a newspaper of general circulation within the ward. For cannabis, they have designated that you have to publish in the Chicago Sun-Times. Then you have to send written notice called the notice to neighbors by first-class mail through the U.S. Postal Service to all property owners within 250 feet of the property lines. And then you have to provide a complete list of the names and the last known address of those people, as well as a written affidavit certifying to the chairman of the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals on or before the hearing is held. Next slide. Now, this is a sample of the letter that you can send out to the property owners. At a very minimum, your letter has to include a detailed description of the proposed special use and the location, the names of the applicant and the underlying property owner, when the application is being filed, and where the neighbors can go for additional information. So there are some minimum requirements, and there is a sample letter that is included in the packet that I referenced earlier that's available on the Zoning Board of Appeals website. But this just gives you some plain language that you can use to notify people of their rights to be heard with regards to your application. Next slide, please. Now, you have to hold a community meeting. This is step 2. So no special use application for a cannabis business establishment may be approved unless the Zoning Board of Appeals finds that the applicant held at least one community meeting in the ward in which that cannabis business establishment is proposing to be located. So the community meeting must be held no later than 2 weeks prior to the date of that anticipated special use hearing before the Zoning Board of Appeals. So notice for such meeting has to be issued, and this is pursuant to the local rules, the local law, no later than 2 weeks prior to that community meeting. So the applicant has to notify the chairman of the zoning board of appeals and the alderman of that ward where the cannabis business is looking to establish itself, in writing the date, the time, and the place of that meeting. And as most of you are probably aware of, it's a great idea to get the alderman where you want to establish your business involved early and often. Having that alderman supporting your vision for your business can be super important. So just keep in mind, there are parameters for when you have to hold that community meeting. Next slide, please. Now, after you've done the notice, after you've published, after you've posted, after you have held that community meeting, you have to appear before the Zoning Board of Appeals at a public hearing at City Hall. Now, normally an urban planner or a certified real estate appraiser must testify that the special use is compatible within that particular zoning district. And so at that public hearing, anyone who has an objection to the proposed plan can also testify about their position. And it's important that you think about what the possible objections from people in the community could be so that you can think about a way to respond to that and kind of have some idea in your mind on how you want to address the concerns that people may bring to you. So it's important to do your homework. It's important to know like who is in the community, who may have an objection, what their objection may be. And again, as I mentioned earlier, support from the alderman and the community really carries significant weight with the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals and within the other municipalities, villages, towns, etc. It's really important if there's a village president that you talk to that village president. If there are older people, etc., it's really important that you talk to people in the community to see if there are objections that you can know about well ahead of time so that you know how you're going to address them. They may have some concerns that you've already carefully thought about and that you're prepared to address in a way that's going to work for everyone and get their buy-in for what you're trying to do. Next slide. Now, there's certain criteria that the Zoning Board of Appeals will take a look at. They're going to look at whether or not what you're proposing complies with all the applicable standards for the Chicago zoning ordinance. They're going to look at whether or not what you're trying to do is in the interest of public convenience, and then it really won't have an adverse impact on the general welfare of the community. They're going to look at whether or not your plan is compatible with the character in the surrounding area in terms of the site planning, the scale of the building, and the project design. And then they're going to also look at whether or not your plan is compatible with the character of the area in terms of the characteristics. When do you plan on being open? What are your hours of operation? What's the outdoor lighting? Will there be a noise or a traffic impact on the area? And then they also want to look at whether or not what you're planning is designed to promote pedestrian safety and comfort. Next slide, please. Now, what happens if you're not able to receive that permit in time? If you don't receive that special use permit before the application deadline, you can still submit your application. You'll need to have the zoning office complete the necessary section in the application, and you have to select the appropriate option for your circumstances. So it is advisable that you initiate the process of applying for that special use permit. Next slide, please. Now, what happens if you're denied that special use by the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals? Keep in mind that there are several communities outside of the city of Chicago that will allow cannabis businesses. So if the option to operate inside the city of Chicago isn't a possibility, consider other areas. And this is not the end-all be-all list. These are just some examples that can give you some idea of other communities that do welcome cannabis businesses, from Aurora to Berwyn. I did a presentation recently out in Hazel Crest, and the mayor of Hazel Crest more than welcomed cannabis businesses, said that he had tons of property that would accommodate the different licenses. Oak Park, Skokie, Streamwood, Waukegan. These are all options in case you're not able to get the special use that you need with the city of Chicago. Also, outside of Cook County, there's Kendall County, there's McHenry County. So there are other options. I'm not sure if people have considered those options. They may actually benefit them better as far as security, as far as having space, as far as having some of the other concerns you may have within the city taken care of outside of the city. So keep in mind that if you're denied zoning, there are other communities that you can consider that welcome cannabis businesses. Next slide, please. Now, I know that some people have also applied for dispensary licenses. So I just wanted to kind of give people a comparison. There is a process for both, but I wanted to kind of compare and contrast the difference between the dispensary license and the craft grower, infuser, and transporter licenses. One of the big differences is that you have to have a proposed location, and it's a requirement for the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter license. With the dispensary license, if you're granted that conditional license, you would get 90 days to secure a location. Now, proof of zoning is not required for the dispensary license, but it is required for craft grower, infuser, and transporter licenses. With the dispensaries, there's no proof of liquid assets that's required. You can provide a statement that you're going to have sufficient funds to operate a dispensary, and that's sufficient for a dispensary application. For the craft grower and the infuser licenses, you do have to provide proof that you have $20,000 in liquid assets. There is no proof of liquid assets required for the transport license. Also, just wanted to show the difference between the application fees and the license fees for a dispensary. Their fees are half. Their license applications are half. So it's a $5,000 application fee for a dispensary and $60,000 for their license. For the grower, who isn't a social equity applicant, the application fee is $5,000 and their license fee would be $40,000. For the infuser, $5,000 and the license fee would be $5,000 as well. And for the transporter, who is not a social equity applicant, the application fee is $5,000 and the license fee is $10,000. For social equity applicants who are getting a dispensary, the application fee is $2,500 and that license is $30,000 versus the $60,000. For social equity applicants, for the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter, the application fees are $2,500. Then the license fees would be $20,000, $2,500, and $5,000 respectfully. So keep in mind, if you qualify as a social equity applicant, your application fee is 50% less than a non-social equity applicant, and the license fees are also 50%. Next slide, please. Now, we all understand that COVID-19 has had a real effect on our daily lives, and it has also impacted, our businesses. The city of Chicago is accepting that exhibit that needs to be signed off on by the zoning by mail. So they are still accepting these exhibits that have to be signed off on by the zoning department by mail. You need to check with any other local municipality for their process for getting that exhibit signed off on. Also, for any applicant that was scheduled to go before the City of Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals on March 20th, that meeting has automatically been rescheduled for April 17th of 2020. The May 2020 Zoning Board agenda has not even been set yet. And I personally spoke with the City of Chicago, their zoning department yesterday for this information. So the building, City Hall is closed, but they are still accepting these applications that need to be signed off on the exhibits by mail. So it can be mailed in and sent back. And as far as anyone who was scheduled to go before the zoning board, they have pushed the meetings. And then as they told me, May, they have not even set that agenda yet. So for the city of Chicago, you can still submit those exhibits that need to be signed off on. For anyone else who's applying outside of the city of Chicago, give a call to your local municipality and ask them what the process is. So everyone has understood that there's been an impact based on COVID-19, and it's being addressed as best they can as far as still accepting these exhibits by mail and getting them back to people. And then also anyone who was scheduled to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals, they haven't lost that opportunity. It's just been pushed to April 17th, and they're going to be updating with information on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Now, we have several resources that are available. They will show you, if you're not sure if you're in a disproportionately impacted area as it pertains to the social equity applicant. There's a map where you can put in your address or your zip code, and you can find out if you do qualify or if you're in a disproportionately impacted area. Also, the Illinois Department of Agriculture will be the governing body that's reviewing these license applications. Before it was IDFPR for the dispensary licenses, but the Illinois Department of Agriculture will be the body that's going to review the applications for the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter license. I highly encourage, if you've not already visited their site, in addition to the forms that are available, they have FAQs that pertain to zoning, which is what we're talking about today, but also other questions. And they actually did a couple of rounds where they asked people to submit questions for them to answer. There are questions that are answered specific to craft grower. There are questions that are answered specific to the infuser. And there are questions that are answered specifically to the transporter license. So I encourage you, if you've not already been out there, to take a look on the Illinois Department of Agriculture site and review the FAQs. There are also webinars and classes and trainings that you can take. Chicago Normal is one of the organizations that is providing this. CPA Academy. There are also, several other options as far as getting classes and training on the cannabis industry. They also have newsletters and have information that you should just sign up for regularly so you can receive updates. Then there's also the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals for those of you who are applying within the city of Chicago. If you are applying outside of the city of Chicago, your local towns, your villages, municipalities all have websites, and they all have contact information of who you can reach out to for that information. So don't forget that the Illinois Department of Agriculture has zoning FAQs that you should refer to in addition to general questions regarding the craft grower, the infuser, and the transporter license. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if you are interested in becoming a client of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic, here is the information. For myself, I'm Joan Clay, and for Renee Hatcher, who's the director of the clinic. If there's some follow-up questions, we gladly welcome questions. We try to answer as best that we can. If it's something that we're not able to answer, we will put you in touch or try to provide another resource for you. And so I encourage that if you have a question about becoming a client for the clinic, we can provide an application for you, an intake application, or if there are some questions after this, we can follow up with you. At this time, I do want to open up questions for you. And also, please be aware that we have Ivy Hart from DCEO here. She's able to answer questions for social equity applicants on the loans. So if you have questions about that as well, please indicate that, because we do have Ivy Hart here from DCEO, and she can answer those questions for you as well.
Hi, Joan. One question that we had in the chat box was about those applicants who might be looking to lease a space from a landlord and what that would mean in terms of going through the zoning special use permit application process.
If you're going to be leasing from a landlord, the landlord has to give permission acknowledging that they know that you're going to be doing a cannabis business at that property. Also keep in mind that any property owner who has a mortgage on the property needs to get permission from the mortgage company in order to have a cannabis business on it. It's a requirement with regards to the mortgage.
If you have any other questions, can you please put them in the chat box at this time?
And keep in mind, we do have Ivy Hart from DCEO to answer social equity loan questions as well. I had a question about whether or not the clinic can review an application to make sure all the questions and exhibits are complete. Unfortunately, we don't review the applications. What we do is we have some clients that we work with, but unless we have a clinic client, we don't have any representation or any involvement with reviewing the applications, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Hi, Karen. This is Ivy Hart from DCO. I saw your question about how soon after March 27th should an applicant expect to hear whether the loan is awarded. So now, when it comes to relations, is by noon of March 30th, so the day before. We'll be giving you acknowledgement letters to say, yes, we know that you applied, and that's what's going to be helping fulfill your liquid asset requirement. As for the dispensary, those letters will be coming later, but what is happening now is that pre-approval letters will be given, which says, so there's 3 different types of letters I want to explain right now. For the round 2 craft grow infuser transporter, there will be acknowledgement letters given the day before your deadline, the day of your deadline, noon, regarding your liquid asset portion. There will also be pre-approval letters to say, yes, we've reviewed your whole application and you're pre-approved if the IDFPR or the DOA approve you, then you'll be getting the funds. So disbursement is upon approval from the other agencies. We just get the pre-approval until then. Yes, so the acknowledgement letters are going out as you send in your applications, but the latest will be noon on the 30th.
Thanks, Ivy. I think we have another question. Applicant wants to know if they should check the title to the property.
Is the applicant asking because they think that the landlord may have a mortgage on the property?
I believe so.
Yeah, I mean, you have to ask that landlord if they have a mortgage and let them know that the mortgage company needs to approve this. I mean, there are ways to check whether or not there is a mortgage on the property with the recorder of deeds site, but you know, landlords are generally need to be honest about that because it impacts your business, it impacts their mortgage. If the mortgage company, for example, were to find out that there was a cannabis company there and they didn't give permission for that, they could call in the loan. So mortgage holders and people with mortgages understand that certain things could result in the mortgage being called in, meaning all the amounts that are owed, that mortgage company would be demanding that the mortgage are paid. So you can check to see if there's a mortgage on there, but the landlord should willingly disclose that because it impacts that landlord as well as you.
Great. Another question from Letitia. So if you have a lease on a property, do you still need a special zoning permit to operate the cannabis business?
The question is if you have a lease on the property?
If you're leasing the property, you don't own it, do you still need a special zoning permit?
Well, you need that based on the fact that you're operating a cannabis business. So it's not based on whether you own the actual property or not, whether you own it or whether you're leasing it from someone. It's the question of whether or not there is a mortgage on the property. But if for a cannabis business, you're going to need that special use permit.
So Greg has a question. He says, if you're unable to secure a special use zoning permit by the application due date, what's the best way to proceed?
You should still submit your application. It doesn't mean that you won't be able to get that. You just have to make sure that they're going to sign off on what the status is, that zoning department, and then you should still submit everything and then do your notice to the people who are within 250 feet of the proposed and have your meeting and still proceed to get the meeting with the Zoning Board of Appeals and get the special permit. There is also a question I see for DCEO about providing funding for the special zoning license, Ivy.
Yeah, so I mean, I think what we've been saying is that it's really once you get approved, it's negotiations around what the money's being used for. As long as it's operational and a special zone license would be, depending on what your other needs are, it can be used for that, just like it can be used for the application, of the license fee later on, not the application fee. So yeah, if you are awarded that license, we can use it for the funding, but it's part of the negotiation. So I wouldn't say it's a complete yes or no. It's just once you get the award, we're in a negotiation around what the money's being used for.
Great. So Michael has a question. Do you see any issues with applicants using residential locations as proposed locations for the craft grower and infuser applications?
Well, there are commercial zoning requirements for the locations, and there's some zoning information that's available for the City of Chicago. The zoning department has some of the requirements for that. So you have to keep in mind that I talked earlier about the criteria that the Zoning Board of Appeals is going to be looking at, and they're going to be looking at how what you're doing is going to impact the area. So if you, for example, are doing this in an area that's totally residential, there are going to be impacts to the community that could get you denied. So you need to look at areas that are zoned for commercial use to start with.
Right. So chances are, I mean, essentially any residential properties will not be allowed to actually be rezoned as cannabis businesses. Simply, I just can't imagine that that would ever happen. Is that right, Joan?
Right. The impact on the community would be viewed as not being worth allowing that business to be in that area. So keep in mind that you're going to have an impact on the community, and that's one of the things that the zoning board takes into account when they are reviewing your application.
So another question, if you receive a craft grower license and are denied for a special use permit or are not able to get a lease worked out, do you lose your craft grower license or can you move your location?
Are you saying, well, you have to be given the license after all of this is approved. So and I think the question is what happens to your application if you're not able to, because you have to identify your location when you're applying for this. So the location will already be identified as it's required. The question becomes if you go through the process and you don't get that special use permit, is that the question?
Yeah.
Because I think I'm hearing what happens to your application fee, and these are non-refundable fees.
So if you're awarded a license for a craft grower business, even based off of the location you submit, and subsequently after receiving the award of the license, you cannot get the special use permit that you need to actually operate the business in that location, would you be able to come up with an alternative location for your license, or would they automatically revoke the license?
That I am not 100% sure of to give an answer right now. That's something I could definitely follow up with you on. I do know that some people have asked what happens if they identify the location and then they have to move the business. Like there are things put into place if you have to relocate, and there's certain notice that you have to give. But that's something I would definitely have to look into and be able to respond to everybody about.
Is a special use permit required statewide?
To my knowledge, every town, village, et cetera, they have to decide if they're going to allow cannabis in their community. Some have flat out said no. For the areas that you are interested in, if on their site they don't mention it, you need to give a call, because some have not made any requirements as far as zoning. Some have no applicable laws in place at the time. They won't say no because they don't have anything that gives them a denial. So I would say that if you have a particular town, village, municipality, county that you're thinking about, you should reach out to them and ask them specifically to point you to what they have decided as far as allowing cannabis businesses.
Then Ivy, there's another question about loans, the DCO loan. If an applicant says or a participant says, I'm only able to obtain the last 4 years of state taxes for my loan application, will my loan be denied?
So we need to talk offline about that. So if you can just put your email address there, then I will connect you with Tiffany Hawkins, who's our cannabis loan and grants manager, because there's just different situations for that. If anyone has that problem, feel free to drop your email and I'll connect you to her. As for the other loan question, Section 1 is about your business. So when you're applying for anything with our office, it's about the business entity. So whatever name you put on your application for the craft grow, infuser, transporter, that's the name we want you to apply with your loan for, as well as when it says principal place of business, that's your LLC address. So really the entity is, we're talking about your business applying, and your business has principal officers within it, but it's your business and that's your identity that you're applying with.
I saw another question asking, because now they've extended the filing date to the 30th, as you all know, and they're telling you to mail in your applications. There was a question regarding whether FedEx was okay or only USPS. Go directly with the instructions that they give, and if they say to mail it in by USPS, use that method. You don't want to risk you try to send it by FedEx or UPS and no one's signing for them, no one's accepting them, etc. So if the guidelines stipulate USPS, use that method to mail in your application.
The other thing, if I could just mention, the Illinois Department of Agriculture is also updating its website page on a regular basis with information about how COVID-19 is affecting and impacting this current round of applications. And so that's also a good place to look prior to submitting your application. They're going to be updating that on an ongoing basis. And so they are monitoring closely how COVID-19 is impacting this application process, and any information or any changes, any additional information you might need will be posted on their website. We have another question, and I think we'll just have time for just a few more. Another question about if you can't get the letter of intent or information from the potential landlord before the application deadline, so you can't get the zoning application in, what should you do?
Well, you have to understand that if you're going to be leasing, you have to have sign off from the landlord. So if that particular landlord is not cooperating with you, you may need to look at a plan B or a plan C, because you have to have authorization from the property owner in order to proceed. So if you're not able to get that from that landlord, then you should rethink and think about moving on to a different location and a different prospective landlord.
And in that case, Joan, would someone also just be able to, or would in that case, to the extent that a location is identified, but there's no paperwork to actually submit the application for a special use permit, would someone still be able to get their zoning authority simply to check a different box?
Well, there is the box that says that you haven't submitted for it yet. The thing is, you have to keep in mind that if that location is iffy and you can't get it, then how can you proceed to give the notice and then get on the zoning board's agenda for your meeting? So it's imperative that the location, that you and any prospective landlord have things kind of worked out. And that doesn't even mean that you have to necessarily sign a lease right here, right now, but you do have to have an agreement from the landlord that if you are granted this license, that they will give a lease to you and that they do approve of you having the business there. So it kind of all has to work together. Otherwise, I wouldn't want someone to jeopardize money if the location and the current landlord that you're trying to deal with is problematic, because you do need to have that. You need to have some sort of agreement with them in order to really move through the process.
Great. I think that's it for questions, if we want to wrap up.
And again, you know, if you want to send questions or follow up after this webinar, if it's something that we cannot address, we always try to find a resource for you. So I do see that there are some people who are going to be following up regarding questions for the loan, and then also regarding zoning. So if there are questions regarding the loan, you can email dceo.adultusecannabis@illinois.gov. We're also going to be sending out the recording of today's webinar. So if people need to revisit certain information or to have links to the resources, it's there. Also, let me correct myself. As far as the email regarding the loans, it is ceo.adultusecannabis@illinois.gov, not DCEO, but ceo.adultcannabis@illinois.gov. And so all the if you registered, you will have access to the recording. We're going to send out the recording. It will have, you can have access to the resources that we listed and contact information.